Billionaire heard a little girl scream, "My mom is inside!" When he looked, the truth shocked him. If the title touched your heart, just imagine what's coming next. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us where you're watching from. The autumn wind carried more than just fallen leaves through the upscale district of Manhattan that evening. Richard Blackwood, 36 and worth more billions than most small countries' GDP, walked his usual route from his penthouse office to his Fifth Avenue mansion. His Italian leather shoes clicked rhythmically against the polished sidewalk, each step echoing the methodical precision that had built his empire. But tonight, something would shatter that perfect rhythm forever. "Mommy's in there! Please, somebody help!" The desperate screams of a child cut through the evening air like a knife through silk. Richard stopped dead in his tracks, his steel-grey eyes scanning the shadowy alley between two luxury boutiques. Most wealthy men in his position would have quickened their pace, perhaps called security, but Richard had learned long ago that ignoring cries for help was a luxury even billionaires couldn't afford. "Please, she's hiding. He's gonna hurt her again." The voice belonged to a little girl, maybe 7 years old, with blonde hair that caught the streetlight like spun gold. She stood next to a large commercial dumpster, her small fists pounding against its metal sides with desperate determination. Her clothes were clean but wrinkled, as if she'd been running. Tears streamed down her dirt-smudged cheeks. "Hey there, sweetheart," Richard approached cautiously, his voice gentle despite his confusion. "What's wrong? Where are your parents?" The girl looked up at him with eyes the color of summer skies, now stormy with panic. "She's in there, my mommy. She's hiding from the bad man, but I can't get her out." "Please, mister, you have to help." Richard's first instinct was skepticism. A grown woman hiding in a dumpster. It sounded like a child's confused imagination, perhaps the result of a game gone wrong or a misunderstanding. But the raw terror in the little girl's voice gave him pause. "What's your name, honey?" "Emma," she sobbed. "Emma Patterson." "And my mommy is Sarah. She's 35 and she's really scared." The man with the loud voice made her hide. He said terrible things, mister, really terrible things that made mommy cry. "Emma, sweetheart, are you sure your mother is actually inside there?" Richard knelt to her eye level, his heart breaking at the desperation in her young face. "Maybe she's just—" "No!" Emma's scream was so sharp it seemed to crack the night air. "She is in there. I saw her climb in. She told me to run if the bad man came back, but I can't leave her. I won't leave her." The child's conviction was absolute, her small body trembling with a combination of fear and fierce determination. Richard had built his fortune on reading people, on understanding when someone was lying or telling the truth. Everything about this little girl screamed authenticity. "Okay, Emma, let me look." Richard approached the dumpster with growing unease. The smell hit him first, not just garbage, but something else: fear, desperation, human sweat and tears. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the heavy lid. "Ma'am, if you're in there, please don't be afraid. I'm here to help." A muffled sound came from within, not quite a sob, not quite a gasp, definitely human. Richard lifted the lid. What he saw inside made his breath catch in his throat, made his chest tighten with an emotion he hadn't felt since childhood. Curled in the far corner, partially buried under bags of restaurant waste, was a woman. Her auburn hair was matted with tears and debris. Her clothes, once probably elegant, were now torn and stained. But it was her eyes that destroyed him, wide, terrified, and filled with the kind of hopeless desperation that spoke of weeks, maybe months, of living in fear. "Oh my God," Richard whispered, his voice cracking. "Ma'am, please, let me help you out of there." When the woman, Sarah, looked up at him with those haunted eyes, and Richard saw something that made his heart stop. Recognition, not of him personally, but of something in his face, in his voice, that told her he might actually be safe. "Emma?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I'm here, Mommy. This nice man is going to help us." Richard extended his hand into the dumpster, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah took it. Her grip was surprisingly strong despite her trembling. As he helped her climb out, he caught sight of bruises on her arms, not the purple-black of physical violence, but the deeper, more insidious marks of psychological warfare, the kind of wounds that didn't show on X-rays, but cut deeper than any blade. "Thank you," she breathed, immediately pulling Emma into a fierce embrace. "Thank you so much." Richard stood there, watching mother and daughter hold each other, and felt something shift deep in his chest. This wasn't just about helping strangers anymore. This was about something bigger, something that connected to parts of his past he'd tried so hard to forget. "Who did this to you?" he asked quietly. Sarah's face went ashen. My ex-boyfriend. Marcus. He gets so angry. The things he says, the way he looks at me when he's drinking. Tonight he said if he found me again." She couldn't finish the sentence. "Where is he now?" "I don't know. Maybe still looking. Maybe at his apartment getting more drunk and more angry." Sarah's voice broke. "I couldn't think of anywhere else to hide. I know how this looks, hiding in garbage like some kind of animal. But Emma, I couldn't let him hurt Emma." Richard looked down at the little girl, who was clutching her mother's hand with both of hers. In Emma's face, he saw something that made his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. He saw himself at 7 years old, watching his own mother try to shield him from his father's rage. But that was a lifetime ago, and a story he'd buried so deep he barely remembered it himself, until now. "Listen to me very carefully," Richard said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had closed billion-dollar deals. "Both of you are safe now. I'm going to make sure of that." "But you don't understand," Sarah started. "I understand more than you know," Richard interrupted, and the steel in his voice surprised even him. "What I don't understand is why the system that's supposed to protect people like you is failing so completely." A distant sound made them all freeze. Footsteps, heavy and unsteady, coming from the direction of the street. Sarah went rigid with terror. "He found us," she whispered. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by a slurred voice that carried the unmistakable edge of alcohol-fueled rage. "Sarah! Sarah! I know you're out here somewhere, you stupid—" Richard didn't wait to hear the rest. In one fluid motion, he positioned himself between the alley entrance and Sarah and Emma, his body language shifting from concerned stranger to protective guardian. His years of martial arts training, something he'd taken up after building his fortune, weren't just for show. "Emma, take your mother behind that dumpster," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off the alley mouth. "Stay low and stay quiet." "But what about you?" Sarah whispered, her voice thick with fear and confusion. "You don't know what Marcus is capable of when he's like this." "I'm about to find out," Richard replied grimly. Marcus appeared at the alley entrance like a storm cloud given human form. He was a big man, probably 6'3", with the kind of bulk that came from years of manual labor and too much beer. His face was flushed red with alcohol and anger, his eyes bloodshot and wild. When he spotted Richard standing calmly in the middle of the alley, his expression shifted from rage to confusion to suspicion. "Who the hell are you?" Marcus demanded, swaying slightly. "And where is she? Where's Sarah?" "My name is Richard Blackwood," Richard said calmly, noting how Marcus's eyes widened slightly at the name. "Good." Even drunk, Marcus recognized power when he heard it. "And I think you need to go home and sleep off whatever you've been drinking." Marcus let out a harsh laugh that echoed off the alley walls. "Richard Blackwood, the billionaire? You've got to be kidding me." His bloodshot gaze swept the alley. "What's a guy like you doing in a place like this? Unless—" His eyes narrowed dangerously. "Unless that lying witch called you somehow. Sarah, get out here now." "She's not here," Richard lied smoothly. And even if she was, I don't think she wants to see you right now. You don't know anything about us, Marcus snarled, taking a stumbling step closer. She's my girlfriend. That kid is practically my kid. I've been taking care of them for 2 years, and this is how she repays me, running away like some kind of taking care of them. Richard's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Is that what you call terrorizing a woman and child? Behind the dumpster, Sarah held Emma close, her heart hammering so hard she was sure it would give away their location. She couldn't see what was happening, but she could hear every word, could feel the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Marcus's face went dark. You don't know what you're talking about, rich boy. Sarah's got problems, mental problems. She makes things up, tells lies. Sometimes she needs to be reminded what's real and what's not. And you're the one who reminds her? Richard asked, his voice carrying a deadly calm that made even Marcus take an unconscious step backward. Someone has to keep her grounded. Someone has to make sure she doesn't fill that kid's head with nonsense. Marcus's voice was getting louder, more aggressive. Emma's a good kid, but Sarah's turning her against me, making her afraid of me when all I want is what's best for both of them. Richard felt something cold and familiar settle in his stomach. He'd heard those words before, a lifetime ago, coming from his own father's mouth. The same justifications, the same twisted logic that painted control as love and fear as discipline. Let me ask you something, Marcus, Richard said conversationally. When you look at Emma, what do you see? The question seemed to throw Marcus off balance. What kind of question is that? A simple one. When you look at that little girl, what do you see? Marcus squinted, trying to process the question through his alcohol-soaked brain. I see a kid who needs guidance, structure, someone to teach her how the world really works. And when she looks at you, what do you think she sees? This time, Marcus's answer came faster, with less thought. Someone who cares about her, someone who's trying to protect her from her mother's crazy ideas. Richard nodded slowly, as if considering this. You know what I think she sees when she looks at you, Marcus. What? The same thing I saw when I looked at my father. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus's eyes narrowed, sensing danger, but not quite understanding its source. Fear, Richard continued quietly. Pure, absolute fear. The kind of fear that follows a child into adulthood. The kind that shapes every relationship they'll ever have. The kind that makes them wonder if they're worth protecting. You don't know anything about— I know everything about it, Richard cut him off. And now his voice carried the full weight of his authority, his power, and something else, something personal and pain-forged. I know what it's like to watch someone you love disappear piece by piece because someone who claims to care about them is slowly destroying their spirit. Marcus was getting agitated now, shifting from foot to foot like a caged animal. She's not destroyed, she's just dramatic. Everything's always a big production with her. Every little disagreement becomes this huge thing where I'm suddenly the monster. Every little disagreement, Richard repeated softly. Is that what you call making a grown woman so terrified that she hides in a dumpster with her child? She chose to hide there, Marcus exploded. I never told her to do that. That's her being crazy again. She chose the safest place she could find, Richard corrected. Think about that, Marcus. The safest place a mother could find for herself and her child was inside a dumpster. What does that tell you about the danger she was running from? For a moment, something flickered across Marcus's face. It might have been shame or recognition, or just the alcohol making him momentarily introspective, but it passed quickly, replaced by renewed anger. You think because you have money, you can come in here and play hero? Marcus demanded. You think you can just wave your wallet around and fix everything? I think, Richard said carefully, that I can make sure Sarah and Emma are somewhere safe tonight, and tomorrow we can start figuring out how to make sure they stay that way. over my dead body, Marcus growled, and took another step forward. That's when Richard smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who just realized his opponent had made a fatal tactical error. "Marcus," he said quietly, "I own 3 security companies, 2 private investigation firms, and I have the personal phone numbers of half the judges in this city. I also have something else you don't." "What's that?" Marcus sneered. "The moral high ground and unlimited resources to defend it." The color drained from Marcus's face as the implications hit him. Richard continued speaking, his voice never rising above conversational level, but each word falling like a hammer blow. "By tomorrow morning I'll know everything about you. Where you work, where you live, what you drive, what you owe, who you owe it to. I'll know about every complaint ever filed against you, every traffic ticket, every time you've been late on rent. And if I find out you've laid so much as a finger on either of them, I will make sure you spend the rest of your life wondering when the other shoe is going to drop." Marcus stood there, swaying slightly, trying to process what he'd just heard. The alcohol was making it hard to think clearly, but even drunk, he could recognize the voice of someone who meant every word they said. "You can't," he started weakly. "I can," Richard said simply. "The question is whether I'll need to." Behind the dumpster, Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Not tears of fear this time, but something else entirely. For the first time in months, someone was standing between her and Marcus. Someone who wasn't afraid of him, who wasn't intimidated by his size or his rage or his ability to make her life miserable. Someone was protecting them. But even as hope began to bloom in her chest, she knew this was far from over. Marcus might be backing down now, but men like him didn't just disappear. They waited, they planned, they came back when you least expected it, and sometimes they brought friends. Marcus stood there for what felt like an eternity, his alcohol-clouded mind trying to process the magnitude of what he'd just walked into. Finally, with visible effort, he took a step backward. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Sarah belongs with me. Emma belongs with me. You can't just steal someone's family." "I'm not stealing anyone," Richard replied calmly. "I'm giving them a choice they apparently haven't had in a very long time." "She'll come back," Marcus said, his voice growing more desperate. "She always comes back. She needs me. She can't make it on her own. She's told me so herself 100 times. Richard felt his jaw clench. He'd heard those words before too, the twisted logic of emotional manipulation disguised as concern. "Maybe she said that because you made her believe it was true." "I gave her everything," Marcus's voice cracked. "I paid her rent when she couldn't make it. I bought groceries when she was broke. I was there when Emma's real father walked out and never looked back. I stepped up when no one else would." "And what did you expect in return for all that generosity?" Richard asked quietly. Marcus's face reddened further. "Loyalty, respect, some basic appreciation for everything I sacrificed for them. And when you didn't get the gratitude you thought you deserved, Marcus faltered, perhaps realizing for the first time how his words sounded when reflected back to him. "I just wanted her to understand how much I'd given up for her. By making her afraid of you." "I never hurt her," Marcus exploded. "I never laid a hand on her or Emma, not once." "There are many ways to hurt someone without touching them," Richard said, his voice heavy with personal knowledge. "Many ways to make someone feel small and worthless and trapped." Behind the dumpster, Sarah's breath hitched. This stranger, this powerful, wealthy man who owed them nothing, somehow understood exactly what she'd been living through. How was that possible? Marcus seemed to deflate slightly, the fight going out of him as the alcohol and the confrontation took their toll. I love her. I love Emma. I know I'm not perfect, but I tried to be what they needed." "Love doesn't make someone hide in a dumpster," Richard said simply. Love doesn't make a 7-year-old girl scream for help in a dark alley. She's overreacting. Sarah always overreacts to everything. A mother's fear for her child is never an overreaction. DeMarcus looked around the alley as if seeing it clearly for the first time. The shadows, the garbage, the desperation that had driven two human beings to seek refuge in the most degrading place they could find. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more uncertain. I don't want to be the kind of man who scares people. That's not who I meant to be. Then don't be, Richard said. Walk away, get help, figure out why the people you claim to love are terrified of you. And if I don't? If I can't just let go? Richard's expression hardened. Then you'll discover exactly how much power unlimited resources and a clear conscience can bring to bear on someone who threatens innocence. Marcus stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked unsteadily toward the alley entrance. Just before he disappeared into the street, he called back over his shoulder, "She'll call me. When she gets scared and alone and realizes she can't make it without someone taking care of her, she'll call me. She always does." Then he was gone, leaving only the echo of his footsteps and the lingering smell of alcohol and desperation. Richard waited a full 5 minutes before speaking. "It's okay, you can come out now." Sarah emerged from behind the dumpster slowly. Emma's hand clutched tightly in hers. Both were trembling, but for different reasons now. The immediate danger had passed, but the reality of what came next was just beginning to sink in. "Is he really gone?" Emma whispered. "For now," Richard said honestly. He knelt down to Emma's level again. "But we need to make sure he stays gone, and that means we need to be very smart about what we do next." Sarah's voice was barely audible. "Why are you helping us? You don't even know us." Richard was quiet for a long moment, his mind drifting back to memories he'd spent decades trying to suppress. "Because once upon a time, I was 7 years old, and I watched my mother hide from someone who claimed to love her, and no one came to help." The words hung in the air, raw and honest. Sarah studied his face in the dim streetlight, seeing something there that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "What happened to her? Your mother?" "She learned to make herself very small and very quiet, and she taught me to do the same." Richard's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the cost of that steadiness. "It took me 20 years to understand that love isn't supposed to feel like walking on broken glass." Emma tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, are we really safe now?" Sarah looked down at her daughter's upturned face, then back at Richard. "I don't know, baby. I hope so." "You are," Richard said firmly, "but safe and free are two different things. Safe is what we're going to accomplish tonight. Free is what we're going to work toward, starting tomorrow." "I don't understand," Sarah said. Richard stood up, brushing dust off his expensive suit. The incongruity of it, a billionaire in a designer suit standing in a garbage-filled alley with 2 refugees from domestic terror, wasn't lost on any of them. "Safe means Marcus can't get to you tonight," he explained. "Free means he can never get to you again, legally or otherwise. Safe is a hotel room and security guards. Free is restraining orders and new identities and a legal system that actually protects the people it's supposed to protect." Sarah felt tears welling up again. That sounds impossible. "You don't know how the system works for people like me. I'm nobody. I have no money, no connections, no—" "You have me now," Richard interrupted quietly, "and I have all of those things. But why?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why would you do this for strangers?" Richard was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and hard-won wisdom. "Because the 7-year-old boy who watched his mother suffer is still here," he said, touching his chest lightly, "and he's been waiting 30 years for the chance to be the help that never came." Emma looked up at him with those summer sky eyes, no longer stormy with panic, but bright with something Sarah hadn't seen in months. Hope. "Are you going to be our hero?" Emma asked with the directness that only children possess. Richard smiled, and this time it was warm and genuine. "I'm going to try to be someone who helps you become your own heroes." "What does that mean?" Emma asked. "It means," Richard said, offering his hand to help them both to their feet, "that we're going to make sure you and your mum never have to hide again. And more importantly, we're going to make sure you never have to be afraid of someone who claims to love you." As they walked toward the alley entrance, Sarah caught Richard's arm gently. "I need you to know something," she said quietly. "What you did tonight, standing up to Marcus like that, no one has ever done that for us before." "They should have," Richard replied simply, "but they didn't. You did. And whatever happens next, whatever this costs you, or whatever complications it brings into your life, I want you to know that what you did tonight saved us. Not just from Marcus, but from something worse." "What's worse than what you've been living through?" Sarah's answer came without hesitation: "Believing that we deserved it." As they emerged from the alley into the light of the street, Richard realized that this night had changed all three of them forever. For Sarah and Emma, it was the first night in months they might sleep without fear. For Richard, it was the night he finally understood what his wealth and power were actually for, but it was also the night that set in motion a chain of events that would test all of them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Because Marcus was right about one thing, this wasn't over. It was only beginning. It was. 3 weeks later, Richard stood in his marble-floored office on the 42nd floor of the Blackwood Tower, staring out at the city sprawling below like a vast circuit board of lights and possibilities. His reflection in the bulletproof glass showed a man who looked like he'd aged years in mere weeks, the weight of protecting Sarah and Emma etched into the lines around his steel-grey eyes. The legal battle against Marcus had begun in earnest, and it was proving more complex than even his considerable experience had prepared him for. The intercom buzzed, breaking his contemplation. "Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Mills is here with the legal briefing," his assistant announced. "Send her in," Richard replied, straightening his tie and preparing for what he knew would be challenging news. Janet Mills entered with the purposeful stride of someone bearing weighty information. At 55, she was one of the most feared family lawyers in New York, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had seen every legal maneuver in the book. Her reputation for winning impossible cases was legendary, which made the troubled expression on her face particularly concerning. "The restraining order was granted," Janet announced without preamble, setting a thick folder of documents on his mahogany desk with a thud that echoed through the spacious office. But Marcus hired representation. Very good representation. Richard turned from the window, his expression darkening like storm clouds gathering over the city skyline. "How good are we talking?" "Davidson, Stone and Associates." Janet opened the folder and pulled out several business cards and legal letterheads. "They specialize in high-stakes family law cases. Their retainer alone costs more than most people make in 2 years, and they don't take hopeless cases or clients who can't afford their premium services." Richard felt his jaw clench involuntarily. The implications were staggering. Marcus was working construction jobs until recently. He's been unemployed for 3 months. There's no way he can afford lawyers of that caliber. "Exactly what I thought. So I did some digging." Janet pulled out a financial investigation report, thick with bank statements and transaction records. Apparently, Marcus has a benefactor. Someone's not only paying his legal fees but also covering his living expenses, apartment rent, and even his therapy sessions, which incidentally he hasn't been attending. Run a complete financial background on him. Bank accounts, credit cards, recent large transactions, employment history, family connections, everything. Richard's voice carried the cold precision that had made him legendary in boardrooms and feared by corporate rivals. I want to know where every penny came from, who's pulling the strings, and what their endgame is. Janet nodded and made notes on her legal pad. Already in progress. But Richard, there's more. Their legal strategy is particularly sophisticated and personally targeted. She opened the folder wider and spread out several legal briefs, each one marked with colored tabs and annotated margins that spoke to hours of careful analysis. They're painting Sarah as mentally unstable, Janet explained, her voice taking on the clinical tone she used when delivering bad news. They have documentation claiming she has a history of erratic behavior, substance abuse issues that I know don't exist, and psychological instability. They're arguing that she's using Emma to manipulate sympathy from wealthy benefactors, and that the dumpster incident was a calculated performance designed to trap someone with resources. Richard felt his hands clench into fists. Those are outright lies. Sarah's never had substance abuse problems, and her behavior has been nothing but protective of Emma. I know that, and you know that, but they have what appears to be convincing documentation. Medical records that have somehow been altered or fabricated, witness statements from people Sarah has never met, employment records showing job performance issues that contradict everything her actual supervisors told us. Janet's expression was grim. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to build a false narrative about Sarah's character and mental stability. And Emma? Richard's voice was barely controlled fury. They're requesting supervised visitation rights. Marcus is claiming established relationship rights based on his 18-month relationship with Sarah and his self-described father figure role in Emma's life. Janet paused, consulting her notes. Richard, Emma is only 5 years old. The judge will take her age into consideration, but continuity of care and established relationships are significant factors in custody determinations. He has no legal parental rights, Richard said flatly, his businessman's mind automatically cataloguing the legal obstacles ahead. No, but he has lawyers who are very good at making judges believe that stability and continuity of care matter more than biological connections. They're prepared to argue that disrupting Emma's established relationship with Marcus would be more traumatic than maintaining supervised contact. Janet leaned forward, her expression serious. But that's not the worst part. They're also raising pointed questions about you. Richard's blood went cold, a familiar chill of vulnerability that he hadn't felt since childhood. What kind of questions? Why would a billionaire, with no apparent connection to this family, suddenly take such an intense personal interest in their welfare? Why would someone of your stature involve himself so deeply in a domestic dispute between two people he'd never met before? They're implying that your motives might not be entirely altruistic. They're not suggesting anything specific, Janet interrupted, her tone carrying the weight of long experience with courtroom tactics. That's what makes this strategy so dangerous. They're just raising questions and letting people's imaginations fill in the blanks. It's a classic approach, create doubt without making specific accusations that could be disproven. Janet pulled out another document, this one marked with red flags and warning annotations. They're painting a picture of a wealthy, powerful man who may have an unhealthy obsession with vulnerable women and children. They're questioning whether your intervention was genuinely altruistic or whether it serves some deeper psychological need. Richard sank into his leather chair, feeling the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being portrayed as the kind of manipulative, controlling figure he'd spent his entire adult life trying not to become. How's Sarah handling all this psychological warfare? About as well as you'd expect. She's scared, angry, and drowning in guilt about involving you in this legal nightmare. Janet sat across from him, her expression softening slightly with genuine concern. She keeps asking if she should just walk away, take Emma and disappear, rather than put you through this character assassination. That's not an option. Emma needs stability, not life as a fugitive. Richard rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. Besides, running would only validate their narrative that Sarah is unstable and unfit. Richard, I have to ask. And I need you to be completely honest with me, because your answer will determine how we proceed. Janet set down her pen and looked directly into his eyes. Why are you doing this? I've worked for you for 8 years, and I've seen you handle corporate mergers worth billions of dollars with less personal investment than you're showing in this case. Richard was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the polished surface of his desk while he wrestled with memories he'd kept carefully buried for decades. The afternoon sunlight streaming through his office windows seemed to fade as he traveled back to his childhood. Have I ever told you about my mother? He asked finally, his voice softer than Janet had ever heard it. No, you haven't. You've always been very private about your family background. Richard stood and walked to a bookshelf that held a few personal items among the legal texts and business journals. He picked up a small framed photograph, a woman with kind eyes and Sarah's same gentle smile, holding a young boy who bore Richard's unmistakable features. Her name was Elizabeth Patterson before she married my father. She had a brother who died young in a car accident, leaving behind a teenage daughter with nowhere to go. Richard's voice was carefully controlled, but Janet could hear the underlying emotion. My mother wanted to take in her niece, but my father refused, said we couldn't afford another mouth to feed, though we were quite comfortable financially. Janet nodded, sensing there was much more to the story. Elizabeth, my mother, never got over the guilt of abandoning her brother's child. She'd lost touch with that side of the family after some bitter disagreements about the funeral arrangements and estate matters. She always regretted not fighting harder to stay connected, not finding a way to help when her niece needed family support. And that niece was Sarah's mother? Sarah's grandmother, actually. The ripple effects of my mother's regret lasted for generations. Richard set the photograph down gently, his fingers lingering on the frame. When my mother died 4 years ago, I found boxes of letters she'd written but never sent. Letters to family members she'd lost touch with, including attempts to reconnect with her great-niece, Sarah. Richard returned to his desk and opened a locked drawer, pulling out a stack of handwritten letters tied with a faded ribbon. She'd been following Sarah's life from a distance for years, wanting to reconnect but never finding the courage to reach out. She was afraid Sarah would reject her, blame her for the family abandonment decades earlier. So when you found them in that alley, I realized I had a chance to do what my mother never could. To be there for family when they needed help, to bridge the gap that had separated our family for too many years. Richard's hands tightened on the letters. Sarah and Emma are my family, Janet. The only family I have left. Janet studied his face carefully, her legal instincts picking up on subtle tells that suggested there was more to the story. Richard, that's a beautiful motivation, and I believe it's genuine. But there's something you're not telling me. Before Richard could respond, Janet's phone buzzed with an urgent message from her assistant. She glanced at the screen and her face went visibly pale, the color draining from her cheeks in a way that immediately put Richard on high alert. "What is it?" Richard asked, already rising from his chair. "Marcus was arrested this morning. He broke into your penthouse." Janet's voice was tight with concern and disbelief. "The security footage shows he was specifically looking for something in your personal office." The color drained from Richard's face as the implications hit him like a physical blow. "What? Is security all right? Was anyone hurt?" "Everyone's fine, thankfully." He triggered the silent alarm system within minutes of entry, and your private security team detained him until NYPD arrived. But Richard, he wasn't there to steal valuables or cause random damage. Janet's expression was deeply troubled. He had photos with him, professional surveillance photographs of Sarah and Emma dating back several years. Richard felt the room spin around him as a cold realization crept up his spine. What kind of photos? High-quality surveillance images, the kind that require expensive equipment and professional training to capture. Janet pulled out her phone and showed Richard several images that the police had shared with her as part of the incident report. These are time-stamped and catalogued like evidence in a criminal investigation. The photos showed Sarah in various stages of her daily life over what appeared to be a span of 3 years. Sarah pregnant with Emma, her belly round with promise and her face glowing with maternal anticipation. Sarah at different jobs, walking to work with the determined stride of someone carrying the weight of single motherhood. Sarah at various apartments, each move documented like entries in a surveillance log. Richard stared at the photos, his mind racing through implications and possibilities, none of them comforting. Someone else has been watching them for years. The question is who and why, and more importantly, how did Marcus get access to professional surveillance materials? Janet leaned forward, her legal mind already working through the complexities. Richard, I think Marcus stumbled into something much bigger than a simple custody dispute. I think someone's been orchestrating this entire situation for years, and Marcus has just been a convenient pawn in a much larger game. What do you mean? Think about it. Marcus shows up in Sarah's life 18 months ago, right around the time these surveillance photos become more frequent and detailed. He becomes increasingly possessive and controlling, creating exactly the kind of situation that would make a vulnerable woman desperate for rescue. Janet spread the photos across Richard's desk like pieces of a puzzle. Then, conveniently, a wealthy family member appears at exactly the right moment to play hero. Richard's stomach churned as he began to see the pattern Janet was describing. You think someone orchestrated our meeting in the alley? I think someone has been very carefully manipulating circumstances to bring about a specific outcome. The question is whether that outcome was meant to benefit you, harm you, or serve some entirely different purpose we haven't yet identified. Meanwhile, 20 blocks away in her small apartment, Sarah sat at her kitchen table trying to help Emma with her alphabet workbook. At 5 years old, Emma was bright and eager to learn. But today she seemed unusually distracted, her attention wandering from the colorful letters to the window overlooking the busy street below. "Mommy, why was that man shouting outside our building last night?" Emma asked, not looking up from the letter D she was attempting to trace with her small fingers. Sarah's heart clenched with familiar anxiety. Despite all the security measures Richard had arranged, Marcus had been lingering around their neighborhood for days, staying just outside the legal boundaries of the restraining order, but making his presence unmistakably known. The security guards had reported him walking past the building multiple times, sometimes stopping to stare up at their windows. "Sometimes grown-ups get confused and make poor choices when they're upset, sweetheart," Sarah explained, trying to keep her voice calm and reassuring while her own anxiety threatened to overwhelm her. "Like when I get frustrated with my puzzle and want to throw the pieces. Something like that, but more serious." Sarah smoothed Emma's blonde hair, marveling at how her daughter could find such innocent parallels to explain away the darkness that had invaded their lives. "Emma, you remember what we talked about? About how, if anyone ever tries to talk to you when I'm not there, I should run to a safe grown-up and tell them right away," Emma recited dutifully, her 5-year-old voice carrying the weight of lessons no child should have to learn. "That's right. And what are the safe places we identified?" "The school office, Mrs." Rodriguez's apartment next door, the security desk downstairs, and the big store on the corner where the nice man knows our names. Sarah nodded approvingly, though her heart broke a little more with each location they'd had to memorize as part of Emma's safety protocol. The phone rang, interrupting their lesson and immediately sending Sarah's anxiety levels spiking. The caller ID showed Detective Santos, and Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she answered. "Mrs. Patterson, I need you to come to the station immediately. We've recovered some materials related to your case that you need to see." "What kind of materials?" "The kind that might change our entire understanding of what's been happening to your family." Detective Santos's voice was serious, but not alarming. "Can you arrange child care for Emma? This conversation needs to happen without her present." An hour later, Sarah sat in the familiar interview room that still smelled of industrial coffee and lingering anxiety from hundreds of previous conversations. Detective Santos entered with an evidence box that looked substantial enough to contain months of investigation materials. "Mrs. Patterson, what I'm about to show you might be disturbing, but it's information you need to have." Detective Santos opened the box and began spreading photographs across the metal table with the systematic precision of someone who'd done this many times before. Sarah's hands trembled as she recognized herself in image after image, but these weren't recent photos taken by some overzealous admirer or concerned friend. These images spanned years, showing her at different stages of her life with Emma, different jobs, different apartments, different seasons and circumstances. "Mrs. Patterson, these photographs span 3 years. They show detailed surveillance of your daily activities, your work schedule, your social interactions, Emma's school activities, your shopping patterns, even your medical appointments." Detective Santos's voice was gentle but serious. "We found them in Marcus Rivera's possession when he was arrested this morning for breaking into Richard Blackwood's residence." "Marcus has been watching me for 3 years?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, her mind struggling to process the implications of such extensive surveillance. "That's what we thought initially. But when our technical team analyzed the metadata on these photographs, we discovered something very interesting." Detective Santos pulled out a technical report filled with timestamps, camera specifications, and geographic coordinates. These images were taken by at least 4 different cameras using professional-grade equipment, the kind used by private investigation firms that specialize in long-term surveillance operations. Sarah's blood went cold as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "You're saying Marcus hired professional investigators?" "Marcus Rivera works construction when he can find employment, and he's been unemployed for the past 3 months. His bank account shows consistent overdrafts, and his credit score is well below what would be required for any significant loans." Detective Santos leaned forward, her expression serious. "Marcus doesn't have the financial resources for this level of professional surveillance, but someone does. Who would do that?" "That's exactly what we're working to determine. But Mrs. Patterson, there's something else that's even more concerning." Detective Santos pulled out a timeline chart filled with dates, events, and photographic evidence. "The surveillance intensified dramatically 18 months ago, right around the time you first met Marcus Rivera at that bar downtown." Sarah felt sick as puzzle pieces began clicking into place in her mind. "You think someone arranged for us to meet?" "I think someone's been very interested in your life for a very long time, and I think they've been using that interest to manipulate circumstances in ways we're only beginning to understand." Detective Santos's expression was grim. "The question is whether their intentions have been to help you, control you, or use you for some purpose we haven't yet identified." Detective Santos opened another folder and pulled out legal documents, financial records, and what appeared to be correspondence between multiple parties. We're executing search warrants related to this investigation. If there are other parties involved in orchestrating your situation, and all the evidence suggests there are, we're going to identify them and determine what their endgame has been. That evening, when Richard arrived for his usual visit, Sarah found herself watching his face more carefully than ever before, searching for any sign of deception or hidden knowledge. Something Detective Santos had said was nagging at her, the idea that someone might be trying to help her or control her, and that those two things might not be mutually exclusive. "How was Emma today?" Richard asked, settling into his usual chair with the comfortable routine they'd established over the past 3 weeks. "She asked about the man who was shouting outside our building last night." Sarah poured coffee from the pot she'd learned to keep ready for his visits, noting how Richard's expression immediately darkened with concern and what might have been anger. "The security team reported Marcus has been walking past the building multiple times daily. He's staying within the legal boundaries, but just barely." Richard's voice carried barely controlled frustration. "I've been considering hiring additional security, perhaps stationing someone in the lobby full-time." "Richard, the police told me something today that I can't stop thinking about." Sarah sat across from him, setting down her coffee cup and studying his reaction carefully. "About Marcus having professional surveillance photos of me going back 3 years. Richard's cup paused halfway to his lips, and for just a moment, Sarah caught a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, concern, or perhaps recognition. "What kind of photos?" "The expensive kind. The kind that suggests someone with substantial financial resources has been monitoring my family's activities for years." Sarah kept her voice carefully neutral, watching for any telltale signs in his body language. "Someone who could afford to hire professional investigators with high-end equipment and long-term contracts." "Sarah, what are you asking me?" "I'm asking if you know anything about surveillance of my family that predates our meeting in that alley 3 weeks ago." Richard was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes fixed on something beyond her shoulder, while his mind seemed to be wrestling with a difficult decision. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she'd never heard before, the sound of someone choosing between competing loyalties. "My mother hired investigators to find your family 4 years ago after she was diagnosed with terminal cancer." Sarah's heart stopped beating for what felt like several seconds. "What?" "She wanted to reconnect with her brother's family before she died. The investigators tracked you to New York, documented your living situation, your employment history, Emma's school enrollment, your daily routines." Richard's voice was steady but pained, each word carefully chosen. "When she died, I inherited those files along with the rest of her personal effects." Sarah felt the room tilt around her as implications crashed through her consciousness like breaking waves. "So you've known about me for 4 years. I've known where you were for 4 years. I've known about your struggles as a single mother, your financial difficulties, your determination to provide for Emma despite limited resources." Richard's hands were steady, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. "But I didn't know about Marcus, about what you were going through with him, until that night in the alley." Sarah stared at him, her mind struggling to process this revelation while simultaneously trying to evaluate its truthfulness. "Richard, those photos the police found go back 3 years. If your mother only hired investigators 4 years ago, and she died 4 years ago, then someone else has been watching you too," Richard finished grimly, his expression darkening with realization and what appeared to be genuine concern. They sat in silence for several minutes, both realizing that their situation was far more complex and potentially dangerous than either had understood. The comfortable routine of their evening visits suddenly felt fragile, overshadowed by questions neither of them could answer. "Richard," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. What if Marcus isn't the real threat? What if he's just another piece in someone else's game, just like we might be? Before Richard could answer, both their phones buzzed simultaneously with emergency alerts. Richard looked at his screen and went visibly pale, his face draining of color in a way that immediately alarmed Sarah. "What is it?" Sarah asked, feeling her familiar anxiety begin to spike. "Janet's been in an accident. She's in the hospital and it's serious." Richard stood quickly, already reaching for his coat. "Sarah, I need to go immediately, but I want you to double-check all the security protocols. Don't answer the door for anyone except uniformed police officers, and even then, call the precinct to verify their identity before letting them in." "Do you think the accident was really an accident?" Richard's expression was grim as he headed toward the door. "At this point, I don't think anything about our situation has been accidental. Someone's been orchestrating events in our lives for years, and I have the terrible feeling that orchestration is accelerating towards some conclusion we can't see coming." As Richard left, Sarah realized they'd moved far beyond a simple custody dispute with Marcus Rivera. Someone with substantial resources and long-term planning capabilities had been manipulating events in her life for years, and now that manipulation was escalating in ways that threatened everyone she cared about. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah wasn't just a victim waiting to be rescued. She was a mother protecting her child, and she was beginning to understand that the real enemy might not be the obvious one. The real enemy might be someone who'd been helping her all along, or someone who'd been using people she trusted to achieve goals she couldn't yet comprehend. The call came at 4:17 a.m., jolting Sarah from the first deep sleep she'd managed in weeks. The shrill ring of her phone cut through the apartment's silence like an alarm bell, immediately triggering her well-developed anxiety response. "Sarah, it's Richard. Janet's awake, and she's asking for both of us urgently. She says she knows who's behind the surveillance and that we're all in immediate danger if we don't act quickly." An hour later, Sarah and Richard sat beside Janet's hospital bed in the intensive care unit. The attorney looked pale and battered, with a significant head wound covered by white bandages and her usually immaculate appearance replaced by the vulnerable reality of someone who'd barely survived what was now confirmed to be a deliberate hit-and-run attack. "I should have seen the pattern sooner," Janet said, her voice weak but filled with the urgent intensity of someone who'd uncovered a terrible truth. "Richard, do you remember the Meridian Pharmaceuticals case from 6 years ago?" Richard's face darkened with immediate recognition, the memory clearly bringing back unpleasant associations. "The pharmaceutical fraud case. We exposed a company that was falsifying drug trial data for their new arthritis medication. People died because of their lies. The CEO we helped convict, Thomas Meridian. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for corporate fraud, conspiracy, and negligent homicide." Janet struggled to sit up, her movements careful but determined. He was also Marcus Rivera's uncle. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice, the connection hitting her like a physical blow. "What are you talking about?" "Thomas Meridian has been orchestrating this entire situation from federal prison. He's been using Marcus as an unwitting tool for elaborate revenge against Richard, and you and Emma have been the bait in a trap that's been years in the making." Janet reached under her hospital pillow and pulled out a tablet computer, her fingers trembling slightly as she accessed files she'd clearly been compiling in secret. "I've been investigating independently since Marcus was arrested yesterday morning. The money for his legal defense, the professional surveillance equipment, the timing of when Marcus accidentally met you at that bar, even the specific apartment building where you were living when their relationship began. It's all been funded and carefully orchestrated by Meridian's network." Richard's hands clenched into fists, his businessman's mind immediately grasping the implications. So Marcus has been working for Meridian all along? Not exactly, and that's what makes this so diabolical. Janet pulled up financial records and communication logs on her tablet. Marcus doesn't know his uncle is manipulating him. Meridian's been feeding Marcus information about you, Richard, making him believe he's protecting Sarah and Emma from a predatory billionaire while actually using him to systematically destroy Richard's reputation and psychological stability. Sarah's mind reeled as she began to understand the scope of the manipulation they'd all been subjected to. So, when Marcus became obsessive and controlling with me, he was being fed carefully selected information designed to increase his paranoia and possessiveness. Meridian studied Marcus's psychological profile extensively during family visits over the years. He knew exactly which triggers would turn Marcus's genuine affection for you into dangerous obsession. Janet's voice grew stronger as she continued, the legal analyst in her taking over despite her physical condition. Meridian understood that Marcus's abandonment issues from childhood, combined with his struggles with alcohol and employment instability, made him the perfect, unwitting accomplice. Every time Marcus felt insecure about his relationship with you, Sarah, Meridian's people would provide him with just enough information to reinforce his fears. "What kind of information?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Photos of you talking to other men, completely innocent interactions that were presented to Marcus as evidence you were looking for someone else. Financial records showing the deposits Richard was making to help with your living expenses, presented as evidence that you were being bought by a wealthy man. Documentation of Emma's behavioral improvements after you met Richard, presented as evidence that Emma was being brainwashed against Marcus. Richard stood and began pacing the small hospital room, his agitation evident in every movement. So the surveillance photos weren't meant to help Marcus track Sarah. They were meant to create a paper trail that would eventually make me look like a stalker. Exactly. Marcus breaking into your penthouse and finding those photos before Meridian was ready to reveal them forced Meridian to accelerate his timeline significantly. Janet pulled up a complex organizational chart on her tablet. The hit and run wasn't random road rage. Meridian's associates were trying to eliminate me before I could piece together the full scope of the conspiracy. "How long has Meridian been planning this?" Sarah asked, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of the web that had been woven around her life. "Since the day Richard testified against him in federal court 6 years ago, Meridian swore in open court that he would destroy Richard's life the same way Richard had destroyed his, but everyone assumed it was just the angry rhetoric of a man facing prison time." Janet's expression was grim with the weight of hindsight. But Meridian's a strategist, not an impulsive reactor. He's been waiting 6 years for the perfect opportunity to strike back. Richard stopped pacing and turned to face them, his expression haunted by realization. So he researched my background, found my family connection to Sarah, and decided to use it against me. More than that, he's been systematically destroying your reputation across multiple fronts. The media stories about your questionable involvement with a struggling single mother. The whisper campaigns in business circles about your psychological stability following your mother's death. The carefully planted suggestions that your wealth has made you unable to maintain normal relationships. Janet scrolled through what appeared to be months of collected evidence. Meridian's goal was to turn you into the very thing you've spent your adult life trying not to become, a powerful man who uses his resources to manipulate and control vulnerable people. He wanted to destroy you psychologically by making you become your own worst nightmare. Sarah felt physically ill as the implications hit her. And I was the bait in this psychological torture. You and Emma were the leverage he needed to make Richard act in ways that could be twisted and misrepresented. Meridian was counting on Richard's protective instincts to drive him toward behavior that could be painted as obsessive or controlling. Janet looked directly at Sarah with compassion and regret. I'm so sorry you've been put through this. Neither you nor Emma deserve to be used as weapons in someone else's war. The custody case, Richard realized, his voice heavy with understanding. If I'd proceeded with trying to get legal guardianship of Emma, you would have looked exactly like a wealthy man trying to steal a child from her mother using legal manipulation and financial pressure. Meridian's lawyers were prepared to present you as a billionaire who orchestrated an elaborate scheme to gain control over a vulnerable family. Janet nodded grimly. Janet. The irony is devastating. They would have accused you of doing exactly what Meridian was actually doing. But it wasn't true, Sarah said, though her voice carried uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Truth doesn't matter if the narrative is convincing enough, and Meridian spent 6 years building a case against Richard in the court of public opinion. He had documentation, witnesses, financial records, expert psychological testimony, everything needed to destroy Richard's reputation permanently. Richard turned back to the window, his reflection showing a man grappling with the realization that his entire adult life had been under siege by an enemy he hadn't even known existed. So everything Marcus did, the psychological abuse, the threats, the escalating control and manipulation, all of that was part of Meridian's plan. Marcus's genuine psychological vulnerabilities made him the perfect unwitting weapon. Meridian didn't create Marcus's capacity for possessiveness, but he certainly fed it with carefully selected information designed to increase Marcus's paranoia about losing you and Emma. Sarah thought about the phone calls from Marcus, his warnings about Richard, his insistence that something didn't add up about Richard's motivations. Marcus wasn't entirely wrong, was he? There really was a conspiracy. He just identified the wrong villain. Marcus was a victim too, Janet confirmed. A victim who became dangerous because he was being systematically manipulated by someone much more sophisticated and ruthless than he could understand. Meridian knew that Marcus's reactions would become increasingly erratic and threatening, which would drive you to seek protection from Richard, which would make Richard appear possessive and controlling to outside observers. Where does this leave us now? Richard asked, his voice heavy with the weight of 6 years of unknowing psychological warfare. Meridian's plan is falling apart. Marcus going rogue and breaking into your penthouse exposed the surveillance network years before Meridian was ready. My survival means his attempt to eliminate witnesses failed catastrophically. And now that we understand the full scope of his operation, we're ahead of him for the first time in 6 years. But he's still dangerous, Sarah said, her protective instincts for Emma making her focus on immediate threats. And Marcus is still out there, still believing Richard is the enemy. Actually, that situation has been resolved. Marcus was rearrested this morning on federal charges related to his uncle's criminal conspiracy. The FBI has been building a case against Meridian's prison network for months, and Marcus's actions provided the final evidence they needed. Janet managed a weak smile. He's not getting out this time, and he's finally going to learn the truth about how he's been used. Sarah felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness wash over her. So it's over. The immediate threat to you and Emma is neutralized, Janet confirmed. But Richard, Meridian still has 9 years left on his original sentence, and now he's facing additional federal charges for conspiracy, witness intimidation, and orchestrating criminal activities from prison. He's not going to stop trying to destroy you until one of you is dead or completely broken. Richard sat back down heavily, the weight of the situation evident in every line of his posture. 6 years of my life, 6 years of paranoia and manipulation and psychological warfare, and I never even realized I was under attack. That's precisely what made Meridian's plan so effective and so cruel. You couldn't defend against something you didn't know existed, and every defensive measure you might have taken could have been twisted to support his narrative about your controlling nature. Janet reached over and squeezed Richard's hand with genuine affection and respect. But Richard, you need to understand something crucial about how you've handled this situation. What do you mean? The way you've responded to Sarah and Emma's crisis, protecting them while consistently giving Sarah the power to make her own choices, being willing to step back when she questioned your motives, focusing on their safety and autonomy rather than your own emotional needs, that proves definitively that you're not the man Meridian was trying to turn you into. I don't understand. A truly manipulative and controlling man would have used this revelation to bind Sarah and Emma even closer to him. See, I was protecting you all along from a threat you didn't even know existed. You need me now, more than ever. You can't trust your own judgment, so you have to rely on mine. Ah. Janet looked between Richard and Sarah with the wisdom of someone who'd seen manipulation in all its forms. Instead, you've consistently empowered Sarah to make informed decisions, even when those decisions didn't serve your interests. You've been transparent about your own vulnerabilities and mistakes. You've prioritized their well-being over your own emotional satisfaction. That's the behavior of someone who genuinely cares about people, not someone who seeks to control them. Sarah had been quietly processing everything she'd learned, her mind working through months of fear and uncertainty with this new context. Now she spoke up, her voice carrying a strength that had been growing since the night in the alley. "Richard, I owe you a profound apology." "No, you don't. Your suspicions were completely reasonable given the information you had access to. But they were based on lies and manipulations that someone else spent years planting and nurturing." Sarah's voice was firm with newfound conviction. "I should have trusted my instincts about who you really are, instead of letting Marcus's paranoia and a criminal's manipulation cloud my judgment about your character." Emma chose that moment to wake up from her nap in the hospital chair where she'd been sleeping peacefully, despite the adult conversation around her. She blinked sleepily at the adults surrounding Janet's bed, her 5-year-old mind taking a moment to orient herself to the unfamiliar environment. "Mommy, is Miss Janet going to be okay now?" "Yes, sweetheart. Miss Janet is going to be perfectly fine, and the doctors are taking very good care of her." Emma looked at Richard with her clear, direct 5-year-old gaze that seemed to cut through all adult complexities to focus on essential truths. "Uncle Richard, are the scary people going to leave us alone now?" Richard knelt down to Emma's eye level, his expression gentle but honest. "The main scary person is going to jail for a very long time, Emma, and Marcus isn't going to bother you and your mommy anymore either." "Good. I didn't like being scared all the time." Emma paused thoughtfully, then asked with the devastating directness that only children possess, "Uncle Richard, are you going to stay with us now that the scary people are gone?" Richard looked at Sarah, a question in his eyes that went far deeper than logistics or legal arrangements. "Emma," Sarah said gently, kneeling down beside Richard, "Uncle Richard has his own life and his own home and his own important work to do. We can't expect him to—" "Actually," Richard interrupted softly, his voice carrying a vulnerability that made Sarah's heart skip, "I was hoping we could all figure out what comes next together, as a family." What does that mean?" Emma asked with the practical curiosity of a 5-year-old who needed concrete explanations for abstract concepts. "It means we get to choose how we want to be a family together. We can live in different places and visit each other regularly. We can live closer together so we can see each other more often. We can spend holidays together and help each other when someone needs help or support." Richard's voice was warm with genuine affection and hope. "What matters most is that we're connected to each other and we take care of each other no matter what." Emma considered this explanation with the seriousness she brought to all important decisions. "Will you still come have coffee with Mommy every day? If your mommy wants me to, and if you want me to, then yes, I'd like that very much." Emma looked at Sarah expectantly, her blue eyes bright with hope and the simple faith that adults could make good things happen if they chose to. Sarah felt tears welling up, but for the first time in months, they were tears of relief and hope rather than fear and desperation. "I think daily coffee sounds absolutely perfect." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of her new apartment, watching the morning sunlight stream through windows she had chosen herself, in a neighborhood she had fallen in love with during long walks with Emma, paying rent she could afford with the job she had found through her own networking and determination. Richard had offered to help with all of these major life decisions, but she had politely declined most of his assistance, needing to prove to herself that she could build a stable, independent life on her own terms. The apartment was modest but filled with warmth, furniture she had selected piece by piece, artwork Emma had created in her kindergarten class, photographs of their small family adventures together, and plants that somehow managed to thrive despite her inexperience with gardening. It felt like home in a way nowhere had since Emma's birth. Emma was in the living room, working on a 1,000-piece puzzle of butterflies, with the intense concentration that 5-year-olds brought to tasks they deemed important. She had adapted remarkably well to their new life, though she still occasionally asked when the scared feeling in her tummy would go away completely. "Soon, baby," Sarah would tell her, and meant it. "A little less scared every day, until one day you'll realize it's gone." The doorbell rang, and Emma looked up with immediate excitement rather than the anxiety that had defined their lives for so long. "That's Uncle Richard. He promised to bring the new puzzle pieces today." But when Sarah opened the door, she found Detective Santos instead, holding a manila envelope that looked official and final. "Mrs. Patterson, I have some news about Thomas Meridian that I thought you'd want to hear in person." Sarah's heart clenched with familiar anxiety, the old patterns of fear threatening to resurface despite months of healing. "What kind of news?" "The kind that closes this chapter of your life permanently." Detective Santos smiled with genuine warmth. "Thomas Meridian was found guilty yesterday on all federal conspiracy charges related to his manipulation of Marcus and the surveillance operation against your family. He's been sentenced to an additional 12 years in federal prison, to be served consecutively with his existing sentence." Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief so profound it was almost overwhelming. So it's really, truly over. It's really over. Meridian will be 78 years old when he's first eligible for parole, assuming he serves his full sentence without additional incidents. Mrs. Patterson, you and Emma are safe. You can stop looking over your shoulders. You can stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. You can just live your lives. After Detective Santos left, Sarah called Richard immediately with the news. Her voice shaking with emotion, she was still learning to identify as relief rather than fear. 12 years, Richard said quietly when she'd finished explaining the sentencing. By the time he's eligible for release, Emma will be 17 years old, graduating high school, preparing for college. This nightmare will be ancient history for her. Are you okay with it being over? With finally being able to move forward without that threat hanging over everything? I'm more than okay with it. For the first time in 6 years, longer than I even realized I was under attack, I can live my life without wondering who might be watching, what someone might be planning, whether my actions are being twisted into weapons against people I care about. Richard paused, and Sarah could hear something like wonder in his voice. Sarah, can I ask you something personal? Of course, always. Are you happy, really, genuinely happy, with how everything has turned out, with the choices you've made, with the life you're building? Sarah looked around her apartment, modest but comfortable, filled with evidence of choices she had made and risks she had taken and small victories she had earned through her own efforts. Through the window, she could see the park where Emma played every afternoon, surrounded by other children and families who had slowly become part of their extended community. "I'm happy," she said, and realized as she spoke the words that she meant them completely. "For the first time in years, maybe for the first time since Emma was born, I'm genuinely, thoroughly happy." Good. That's what matters most to me. Richard, can I ask you the same question? Are you happy? I'm getting there. It turns out having family is different from what I expected. Different how? I thought it would be primarily about protecting and providing for people, about using my resources to solve problems and eliminate threats. Richard's voice carried a thoughtful quality, as if he were discovering something about himself as he spoke. But it's really about knowing there are people in the world who care whether you're okay, and caring about them in the same fundamental way. It's about belonging somewhere, to someone, in a way that doesn't depend on what you can do or provide. Is that what we are? Family? Richard was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could almost hear him choosing his words carefully. I'd like to think so, if you're comfortable with that. But only if it feels natural and right to you, not because you feel obligated or grateful. On one condition. What's that? No more secrets ever, about anything. If something's bothering you, you tell me. If someone threatens you or makes you uncomfortable, you tell me. If you're struggling with something or need support, you tell me. We face whatever comes next together as partners, or we don't face it at all. I can absolutely live with that condition. In fact, I'd prefer it. Good. Because Emma's been asking when you're coming for dinner again, and I've been wondering the same thing. How about tonight? I'll bring dessert and groceries for breakfast tomorrow. Uncle Richard, Emma called from the living room, having apparently been listening to the conversation. Did you tell Mommy about the surprise? Richard laughed, a sound of pure joy that made Sarah's heart feel light. What surprise, Emma? The one where we get to go to the Natural History Museum next weekend and see the dinosaur bones and the butterfly exhibit. Sarah looked at her phone with amusement and affection. Richard, did you plan a museum expedition without consulting the other adult in this family? Emma and I may have discussed the possibility when I took her for ice cream last weekend, but I was absolutely going to clear it with you first, I promise. Well, I suppose a museum adventure would be acceptable. As long as you're prepared for Emma to want to become a paleontologist for at least the next month. I'm prepared for Emma to want to become anything she dreams of being. That evening, as Sarah tucked Emma into bed in their safe, comfortable apartment, her daughter looked up at her with those bright blue eyes that had started this whole journey with their desperate cry for help in a dark alley. Mommy, I'm really glad Uncle Richard found us that night. Why's that, sweetheart? Why's... Because now we have a real family, and we don't have to be scared of people who say they love us. Emma paused thoughtfully, working through concepts that were sophisticated for a 5-year-old, but that had become part of her lived experience. Uncle Richard says love is supposed to make you feel safe and happy, not scared and worried. Where did you learn that? Uncle Richard told me when I asked him why Marcus used to make you cry, but Uncle Richard makes you smile. Emma's matter-of-fact delivery made the wisdom even more profound. He said, real love makes people feel free to be themselves, not trapped or afraid. Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. And how do you feel about that? I like it. Uncle Richard gives really good hugs, and he doesn't get scary mad when things don't go the way he planned. Emma yawned, settling deeper into her pillows. Mommy, do you think Uncle Richard's mommy would be happy that he found us? I think she would be incredibly happy, Emma. I think she would love knowing that Uncle Richard isn't alone anymore, and that we're not alone anymore either. Good, because I think she would like knowing that we take care of each other now. As Sarah turned off Emma's bedroom light, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point of safety and belonging. 6 months ago, she had been hiding in a dumpster with her daughter, convinced that her life was falling apart beyond repair. Now she had a home she had chosen, work that gave her purpose, a daughter who felt secure enough to dream about becoming a paleontologist, and family who had proven that love could exist without control. It hadn't been the fairy tale rescue she might have imagined in desperate moments. There had been no white knight, no simple villain, no easy resolution that solved all problems instantly. Instead, it had been something more complex and ultimately more valuable, a real life with real people, making real choices based on love and trust rather than fear and manipulation. The next morning, Richard arrived for coffee, as had become their Saturday tradition. But instead of his usual composed demeanor, he seemed slightly nervous, fidgeting with his car keys and glancing around the apartment as if seeing it for the first time. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you, and I want to be completely transparent about it because we promised no more secrets." Sarah's old anxieties immediately surfaced, though more gently than they once had. "What kind of something?" "The kind that I should have mentioned earlier, but I was concerned it might complicate our relationship or make you feel pressured." Richard sat down across from her, his expression serious but open. "I've been seeing a therapist for the past 4 months, Dr. Patricia Chen. She specializes in helping people who've experienced long-term psychological manipulation." "You mean because of what Meridian did?" "Because of what Meridian did, and what my father did before that, and because I wanted to make absolutely certain I would never become the kind of person who uses power or resources to control people I care about." Richard's voice was steady but vulnerable. "I wanted you to know because Dr. Chen thinks it might be helpful for you to talk to someone too, if you're open to the idea." Sarah considered this suggestion, recognizing the wisdom in it. "Not because there's something wrong with me, not because there's anything wrong with you, but because surviving what you've been through, the psychological manipulation from Marcus, the discovery that your entire situation was orchestrated by a stranger's revenge plot, the process of rebuilding your life and sense of agency, that's a lot of emotional work to process alone." Richard pulled a business card from his wallet and placed it on the table between them. "Dr. Chen knows, a colleague who specializes in helping people recover from domestic psychological abuse and regain confidence in their own judgment and decision-making abilities. She also knows someone who works with children who've witnessed domestic conflict." "You think Emma needs therapy too?" "Emma seems to be doing remarkably well, but she's also 5 years old, and she's experienced multiple traumatic situations followed by major life changes. Professional support couldn't hurt, and it might give her tools for emotional resilience that will serve her throughout her life." Sarah looked toward Emma's bedroom, where her daughter was getting dressed for their planned trip to the farmer's market. "What about you? What are you working on in therapy?" Richard smiled with a self-awareness that was both rueful and hopeful. "Learning the difference between helping and controlling, learning to recognize my own emotional needs instead of just focusing on solving other people's problems. Learning that having resources doesn't make me responsible for fixing everything, and that sometimes the most helpful thing I can do is step back and let people solve their own challenges." "And how's that going?" "It's harder than building a billion-dollar company, I'll tell you that much, but it's also more important." Emma appeared in the doorway, dressed in her favorite sunflower print dress and carrying a small backpack for their market adventure. "Are we ready to go find the best strawberries?" "We're ready," Sarah said, looking at Richard. "And Uncle Richard, I'd like Dr. Chen's colleague's contact information." I think you're right about professional support being valuable. Really? Really. And I think Emma might benefit from play therapy too, not because she's struggling now, but because prevention is better than treatment. As they walked to Richard's car, Emma took both their hands, creating a small chain of connection between the three of them. "Uncle Richard," Emma said, "will you tell me more about your mommy today? I like hearing about families." "I'd be happy to, Emma. She would have absolutely adored meeting you and your mother. Do you think she's proud of us for taking care of each other?" Richard glanced at Sarah over Emma's head, his expression soft with affection and something that might have been wonder. "I think she's very proud of all of us, Emma, especially because we learned that the best kind of family is the one where everyone gets to choose to be there." "What does that mean?" It means nobody has to stay because they're scared to leave, or because they don't think they deserve better, or because someone else is making them stay." Richard's voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Everyone stays because they want to be together, because being together makes everyone happier and stronger." Emma seemed satisfied with this explanation. "Good, because I want us to be together for a really long time." As they drove toward the farmer's market, Sarah realized that Emma had articulated something profound in her 5-year-old directness. They were together not because circumstances had trapped them, not because manipulation had bound them, and not because gratitude had obligated them. They were together because they had chosen each other again and again through crisis and recovery and the slow, careful work of building trust. And that choice, renewed daily through small acts of care and consideration, was the strongest foundation any family could have. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah looked toward the future with anticipation rather than anxiety, knowing that whatever challenges might come, they would face them together. As partners, as family, as people who had learned that love looked like freedom instead of a cage with golden bars. It was a future they would build themselves, one brave choice at a time.